I've had lots of fantastic teachers in my life, but I think there's definitely one who really stands out for me. And he was a man who taught me in high school. I had him for a few years in a few different subjects. I had him first of all in history in what we called fourth. I was about 15 years old. And he was so enthusiastic about travel. He would just get so excited telling you about places. And, had a teachers, this was in the 70s, and a teacher at that time had a lot of extra time, a lot of holidays, and every holiday they would go away and they would go to Bali or go to Rome or, I barely left the suburb that we lived in. So the idea of getting on an aeroplane, especially coming from Australia, I think it was not as common. It was a big thing to go off traveling. Anyway, he would come back and tell us about customs and tell us about Hong Kong and tell us about Bali. And half the kids in the class were sort of kicking each other under the table. But I was sort of like riveted, like, oh, wow, And I'm sure he really put some sort of wanderlust travel bug into me. But that's only one part of the story. He had polio as a child, quite badly. And was quite big, and he had a cane to walk, and he had quite a jowly face, and he would get so excited and tell you about blah blah and Bali and rituals of Hong Kong and the noise and the clamor and the dim sum, and you would not sit in the front. I loved sitting in the front, but you'd sort of get spat all over, so everybody would be like like this. Anyway, he was famous for that. So, but I adored him anyway. And he was just such a wonderful person. The next year he taught me English. And then in my final year at school, my father died when I was 16. I ended up having to leave school. I started my final year, whatever you call the final year in America. I started my final year of school and then I had to leave. My mother wasn't well. I'm the oldest of 9 children. So I really had to sort of take on quite a lot of responsibility. But I was determined to go back to school the next year, which I did. And then, of course, I was a bit older. Anyway, I was a bit older. I was a bit more mature. I mean, I was the oldest of 9 children, so I was already a bit more mature than most of the kids. And then when I went back to school the following year to do my final year, I had, with him, I had 18th century history, which was basically the French Revolution. And he was he was just such a brilliant teacher and he loved the French Revolution. And there was another Michelle in the class, Michelle de Kretzer, who's actually a very well-known writer in Australia. And she had emigrated to Australia from Sri Lanka when she was, I think, about 12 or 13. And anyway, so we were the 2 Michelles, and we were the sort of, we were the little pets in the class because we were the star students of the class because we loved it and we worked really hard. She was a super smart girl and worked even harder than I did. We both did really well in 18. We got the highest marks in the whole school and all that sort of thing and external exams. And he was very proud of us. So let's move on. I leave, I go traveling, I go back to Australia. About 12 years later, I'm in Hong Kong and I've opened a restaurant. This is early 90s in Hong Kong. I opened a restaurant and we had a lot of publicity, and I get a letter from Mr. David Pittock saying, "Oh, Michelle, I'm so proud and I read about you in this magazine and isn't that wonderful? And I love Hong Kong and I often come to Hong Kong and blah, blah, So I write back to him and say, "Oh, Mr. Pittock," because he's a teacher, so you always call them by their sort of proper name. "Oh, Mr. Pittock, it's so nice to hear from you." And we have this correspondence and we keep in touch with each other vaguely but I didn't see him in Hong Kong. About another 10 years later, maybe 15 years later, I get an invitation to a 60th birthday party in Hong Kong. So he's having a 60th birthday party in Hong Kong. And I think, why on earth would he be having a 60th birthday party in Hong Kong? I mean, this man from Melbourne, and how can he know anybody in Hong Kong? So I go along to this party. It's in a big Chinese restaurant. It's in a private room. I walk into this private room thinking it'll be a table for 10 people and he'll know a couple of other people. There are about 100 people in the room. I sort of say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong party, you know, and I go to walk out. Then I see him. He's like, oh, Michelle. I was like, oh, hi. So I'm like, I sit down and he said, you're sitting with so-and-so and so-and-so. I was like, okay. The whole room is full of Chinese people. There are 3 people who are not Chinese. There's me, him, and his traveling companion who was an English teacher. And I sit down at this table and I say, how, you know, they say, who are you? And I say, oh, I'm Michelle and I went to Elwood High School. And they were like, oh, yeah, did you know, what year were you? And I said, I was that year. And then they say, oh, did you know Bill? Did you know Jean? Did you know them? Did you know them? And I think, I don't know any of these people. So it transpires, I get the story over this dinner that what had happened was that actually before I went to the school, there was a guy who'd come from Hong Kong, and I guess at the time of the riots, I guess 67, 68, 69, around those years. And he had been sent to stay with relatives, Chinese guy from Hong Kong, had been sent to Australia to a high school to do his last 2 years of school. And you have to sort of know a bit of Hong Kong. I know Hong Kong well. I've lived there for many years. So I understand completely why people were sent there. Anyway, he is outside the headmaster's office. He told me the story himself. He's outside the headmaster's office because he's not able to study. And he said to the headmaster, I need to find a solution somewhere to stay because I'm staying with relatives, sort of relatives, but they're making me work in their Chinese restaurant the whole time. So actually I haven't got time to study and I need to study, you know, I really have to study. And so David was there and he basically said, look, he can stay with me. I've got a 3-bedroom house. I have to cook anyway. I'll feed him dinner and breakfast and, you know, pack his lunch for school. And I have to come to school and he can stay with me until he's finished. So that's what happened. And I sort of think this is such a great story because, you know, I was originally like, oh my God, I hope nothing untoward ever happened here, you know, and it's not going to be some horror story coming out. It's immediately what I thought, which, you know, shame on me. As it turned out, so I said to him, so his name was Bill. And I said to him, so who's this? And he said, well, that's my cousin. And when I finished and my cousin went to stay with David. And then his friend, their daughter, so David always had for those, actually still now, had boarders in his house and they were all Chinese. So the oldest person sitting in that room at that dinner was nearly 100, was somebody's grandmother, and somebody had just had a baby. So there was an age range of nearly 100 years at this 60th birthday party for this remarkable man. And, you know, he was just a person who gave so much. He was super smart. He taught me so much he was so curious. He taught me about language. There were still things that I remember from sitting in a classroom at 15 years old, which I think is really the mark of a truly remarkable teacher. And we keep in touch. He had he had what they call senile polio onset again. So he's very crippled. He's now in a wheelchair and extremely crippled, but he just is indomitable in his spirit. He's positive, he's optimistic, he's just a truly remarkable man. And I think that when, you know, if I think about him, I think about the challenges he had in his life. He also, I think at quite a young age, I don't know what happened to his parents, but, you know, he didn't live, both his parents were dead. So he was an only child. And so he had this big house with like 4 bedrooms, and that was his life. He ended up with this life of giving refuge and a home to half of Hong Kong. And they're all still, I mean, I went to a dinner last year. The year before, not 2020, of course, no one went anywhere. 2019, I think it was the closing of the Excelsior Hotel in Hong Kong, which he always stayed at the Excelsior. And when they closed it, I think they've pulled it down or turned it into an office block or something. He had a dinner on the final night, and I went along, and there was Bill and Jean and Spencer and me and this sort of cohort of his, his like key students. And the other great thing he did was that he reunited Michelle de Kretzer and I. So I knew vaguely, I thought, oh, I went to school with her. And then I invited her to a literary festival. So then we have stayed in contact with each other. So it's really very interesting sort of how one path has led to another path.